Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and it's been a busy week. War abroad, conflict at home, an election coming up, Islamophobia on the airwaves, and more. We have a lot to cover, so we'll get right to it. Our first guest here to talk to us about the ongoing situation in Iraq and Syria is our good friend Stephen Miles, who joins us once again. Stephen is the advocacy director for Win Without War, a coalition of 40 member organizations formed originally in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was many years ago, but the wars continue and morph and change as they do. Stephen, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, RJ. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Always glad to have you. Now, listen, I wanted to just ask you, if you would, to start out by giving us a brief kind of catch up. I don't know if this is true, but some people I talk to are just suffering from a little bit of information overload on what's going on in Iraq and Syria, with the talk about ISIS or ISIL and the Islamic State, and the discussions about Kurdistan and so on. But
Sure.
Give us a quick update, if you would, on how you see the situation now.
Sure. And then, we can add in, there's a host of other stories in the news, from Ebola to the elections, as you mentioned. So there's a lot going on. We are now a little over 2 months into our latest war in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. has been bombing and using airstrikes in Iraq beginning on August 8th. And in the middle of last month, we expanded that operation into Syria with a number of airstrikes on locations there. Now, pretty much on a regular basis, the U.S. is striking targets both in Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, those strikes continue to be pretty much in the same places where they were previously, so around the Mosul Dam, around Mount Sinjar, around various places in Anbar province, which is to the west of Baghdad. And then in Syria, we see them kind of in a number of different places. So we've seen a lot of strikes on Raqqa, which is the kind of capital, if you will, of where ISIS is. We're also now seeing a number of strikes around a Kurdish town called Kobani, which is on the border between Syria and Turkey. That town's been kind of under siege, as it were, from ISIS militants for a number of weeks, and there's a very pitched battle going on between Kurdish fighters, Syrian Kurdish fighters. They've been joined by some Kurds from Turkey. The civilians, by and large, have left the town, although there is unfortunately still a number of them trapped there. And the U.S. has kind of upped the airstrikes there in the last couple of days, with several dozen airstrikes in the area. The latest out of that conflict today is that the fight kind of continues to rage on. So if you take a step back, in the grand scheme, since we've been talking about this on your show, ISIS is pretty much in the same place as they were. Unfortunately, 2 months ago, there's been a kind of a slowing down of their advance, as it were, but there's not been any significant rollbacks. We continue to wait on the full formation of the government in Iraq, and of course, the broader civil war in Syria rages on across the entirety of the country.
Well, I guess one of the questions that comes up, well, a new number of questions come up in all of this. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned Ebola and some of the other issues, because I think there's at least culturally, a connection among all of them, and we'll get to that. But just to get a sense of the things on the ground, we're talking with Stephen Miles of Win Without War. Just to get a sense of things on the ground, one of the criticisms we're hearing, rightly or wrongly, is that there's fighting very close to Turkey, as you mentioned, but that we hear people say that Turkey isn't doing enough or getting involved enough in this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you think we have to kind of understand the proximity we're talking about. Turkey literally has soldiers, tanks, its military massed on the border here, and they can quite literally see the fighting going on in Kobani, hundreds of yards away, as it were. And so they're kind of sitting by, watching the fight unfolding. They have their guns trained on the fight, but there's no firing going on. There's a couple of things about this. Vice President Biden kind of made the kind of classic Washington gaffe the other day, where he said something that was absolutely true, but the kind of thing you're not supposed to say, and was forced to walk it back. what Vice President Biden said was that it's unconscionable that Turkey's not doing more, and they need to be doing more. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be doing more militarily. But for instance, there's been at various times over the last several weeks, the Turks have closed the border both into Syria to supply and provide resources to the people in Kobani, but also closing the border to refugees fleeing. Now, they've taken a massive number of refugees. There's over 1 million Syrians who are taking refuge in Turkey. But one of the ways to alleviate the human suffering is to continue to let civilians flee this conflict. And there's no excuse whatsoever for Turkey to ever keep those civilians trapped a couple hundred yards away from safe territory in the middle of a conflict zone.
One assumes that they do that because they don't want to have refugees within their borders, but that's a pretty inhumane attitude, as you point out. I guess the other thing that strikes me, and you tell me if this is a fair thought or not a fair thought, but we have
Mm-hmm.
Lindsey Graham. We have Lindsey Graham running around Washington saying, "Oh my God, literally, they're going to kill us all,"
Yeah.
and yet we have the government of Turkey, which is literally next door to the conflict, basically saying with their military actions and the positioning of their army and so on, as long as they don't cross our borders, we don't care. Those seem to be diametrically opposite positions. And aside from saying, well, maybe there's a happy medium to be struck somewhere, and that Turkey at a minimum should do more to help in a humanitarian way, doesn't that provide even more evidence that the Lindsey Grahams of this world are being hysterical and stirring up fear and warmongering?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the premise that Lindsey Graham being hysterical is kind of his normal state of play, and and we need to remember
Right.
that this is a politician who has kind of been screaming bloody murder about these threats about people coming to kill us pretty much the entire time he's been in public office. And so I've joked from time to time that it must be really hard to be him because if you have this worldview, there's someone waiting behind every bush to kill you. Um, he's more than welcome to whatever his own beliefs are, but that's a really horrible way for the U.S. to run its policy and a way to evaluate the situation. We have to have a kind of rational threat assessment about these conflicts, and part of that involves understanding how our friends in the region and how the people in the region, maybe who even aren't our friends, see this challenge and see this conflict. The Turks are the ones who have to live with this on their border. We need to understand how they view the threat, and they need to understand. And if they're viewing it very differently from how we're viewing it, then we need to have some time and space to think about that. Now that said, and the same holds true for the Jordanians, for the Israelis, for kind of all the other players in the region. One of the things, though, that we have to keep in mind is that the Turks are playing an incredibly crass game, which goes back decades and has to do with the Kurdish separatist movement in Turkey. And there's a somewhat valid argument to be made that the Turks are willing to see this conflict play out in a way that they would not otherwise, because of their feelings about the Kurds and because of concerns of rising Kurdish separatism in Turkey. Not for nothing, there's been protests all over Turkey over the last couple of days, and I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 dozen folks have lost their lives in those protests. So this is a growing problem for Turkey, not just on its border, but in terms of its domestic politics. And they're going to need to change some of the things they're doing, or this situation is going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
All right. Well, when we come back from break with Stephen Miles from Win Without War, I want to talk a little bit about the broader picture, U.S. involvement, and maybe how we're using other forms of fear to drum up support for our efforts there, as misguided as they may be in one's personal opinion. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. This is Richard RJ Eskow, and we're talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War, about the situation in Iraq and Syria and a bit more broadly. So Okay, so we've got the situation, Turks remaining inactive, uninvolved, even with the situation in Kobani, the situation on their border, and the situation in Kurdistan, for a number of reasons, including presumably ethnic. We have, as you were saying, ISIS not gaining ground, but apparently not being shaken either. So, or not being driven back in any case? What's the status inside the ISIL territory itself? Vice did an interesting series on that. Is it functioning in any way as a genuine state at this point? People are treating it as if it is a state. Of course, it describes itself as a caliphate, which may be
Hmm.
theologically unsound. But what are they? Do we know what life is like? Is it a relatively stable nation state in a weird way, or is it just chaos inside there, or do we even know?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing is we have to acknowledge we don't have a full and accurate picture for obvious reasons. Reporting from under ISIS controlled territory is incredibly difficult. The reports that come out, we have to be suspect about. There was a leaked There was a document that kind of came out that was purported to be rules that ISIS has issued for journalists
Right.
reporting in their area they control, which included that journalists could only kind of report what was already approved by them. So obviously, we would need to question anything that came out of that region. But it does appear that they are making genuine efforts to govern the territory that they're controlling, and at the same time they're committing lots of atrocities and lots of violations in those areas. Many of them aimed at kind of getting more money to fuel their purposes. So, for instance, we know in areas they control, they're looting all the antiquities, of which there are tremendous historical antiquities and sites in these regions in Iraq and Syria. They're looting them. They're selling that on the black market. There's extensive extortion, opera kind of protection rackets, very classic kind of mafia, if you will, type programs being run in
Mm.
the towns and villages that they control. Ways that would be familiar to people who studied the mafia here, where a small number of folks can exert a massive amount of control over the day-to-day operations in villages and cities. Um, and then we do hear stories out of places like Raqqa, where they are trying to institute the type of Islamic courts, the type of Islamic justice, the type of kind of Islamic governance that we've seen in places like previously in Afghanistan when the Taliban ruled there. We saw efforts to do so in Somalia when al-Shabaab was briefly in charge of a significant portion of the country. So unlike simply what we saw with al-Qaeda, where it was a bit more just truly focused on kind of the horrific acts of terroristic violence towards the West that we've seen. This is kind of an amalgamation of that combined with some efforts to govern the territory that they've now controlled. And it is one of the things that makes ISIS different. But it also makes the solutions different. We have to understand why, by some accounts, some of these Sunni tribes, some of the folks under their control, are choosing to ally with them and live under this type of government that they're providing, as opposed to allying with the government in Baghdad or the government in Damascus. And so, altering those calculus and that choice is part of what we need to do going forward, and part of the long-term solution.
Right, and I think and that's exactly why I bring it up for a couple reasons. One is that in all the talk about combating Al Qaeda, a number of people wisely pointed out that you use a different strategy for non-state actors, as they were called, than for state
Mm-hmm.
actors. ISIL or ISIS seems to be a hybrid, partially non-state, partially state, and so it brings up some interesting strategic issues. But it also, as you say, it's very important for people to understand why Sunni tribes might ally with them. For example, they might offer, to me, I wonder, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I wonder if in any sense there's some analogy to what happened with Hamas in Palestine, which is people, it's very easy to kind of say, well, oh, they're Muslims and they like that
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. But the fact is that Hamas was opening schools or, providing a semblance of state functions that was otherwise not being provided. I wonder if, in any sense, as horrific and savage as they are, people felt, well, these Sunni tribes, for example, might feel, well, they're imposing order and we hate the Shiite government in Iraq and they've done nothing to reach out to us. So why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to remember that especially in Syria, these are folks who've lived now for 3 years with a brutal, horrific civil war. In Iraq since the 2003 invasion, it's been kind of one period of bloodletting and mass atrocities after another. And there's a lot of folks who just would like some semblance of calm and order.
Right.
And similar to what we saw in Afghanistan with the rise of the Taliban, people didn't necessarily want to live under that type of, brutal autocratic rule. But when you offer it to them as an alternative after a decade plus of civil war, when you offer it to them as an alternative to kind of the constant sectarian bloodletting, the constant tribal bloodletting, the kind of violence and kind of death squads that dominated so much of Iraq's recent history, the type of horrible abuses we've seen by the Assad regime and others in Syria, you begin to understand why people are looking for some semblance of order, even if it's
Right.
hard for us to imagine how one could make that choice from where we sit. And if you can't change that fundamental dynamic, then you're going to see some of what we've seen already in Syria, which is backlash from the U.S. military intervention. Folks saying, "Why are you attacking these guys who are bringing
Right.
us food, who are bringing us water? Why are you not attacking Assad? Why are you not, why are you aligning with the Shia militias who are committing horrible abuses in Iraq?" And you're going to see the type of just constant, and this is just going to be another period in the kind of endless circle of violence that we've seen in the region. We can go down that road, but it won't bring peace. It won't bring stability. It won't bring any more security to America. We have to break that cycle of violence, and you don't do that by bombing yourself.
See, and we only have about a minute left, but that's exactly. And I did want to get to maybe next time, Ebola and how it
Mm-hmm.
stokes fear of foreigners and so on. But we won't get there. But in the minute we have left, I guess uh, that's something that I want to emphasize too. Is that if people, they haven't read Locke or necessarily our Western theories of democracy, but if all they know about the United States is we're the people that bombed, we're the people that maybe caused some civilian deaths somewhere, isn't that going to just inflame in the 30 seconds we have left, I guess, isn't that
Yeah.
going to just inflame the cycle of violence even more? And isn't that what we should be pushing against here at home?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We just have to remember that this is a region on fire, and seldom in history have you put fires out by pouring more gasoline on them. And frequently, you end up creating a fire that comes back and burns you yourself. So we need to be really careful. And I might close just with commenting. I think where you're going to go a little bit later in your show. We've got an election coming up, and however people feel about these issues, they need to hold their elected officials accountable. They need to get out and vote. It's an incredibly important part of what makes America great. And I hope that everybody who's listening will get out there and make their voices heard on Election Day.
Well, I can't argue with that, and I hope everybody will make their voices heard after Election Day too, saying that this kind of irrational policy based only on bombing makes no sense, and they want it to stop. Okay, Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
You too. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.